Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar tonight. We'll just give it a couple more minutes for people to join. It's great to see so many of you already. Hello to everyone joining. We're just going to give it a couple of more minutes just for some more people to get online, and then we'll get started. Hello to those people coming through. We're just, give it a few more minutes, maybe one more minute, and then we'll get started. Okay, great. Nice to see so many of you online tonight. We'll get started. So hello, I am Ailsa McConaughey-Folwell and I work at the City of Sydney in the Renewables and Strata Resilience team. And welcome to our Emergency Preparedness in Strata webinar. So firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation whose land I am on today. They are the traditional custodians of this land, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So just some housekeeping. Please ask questions throughout this webinar. However, I just ask that you pop all your questions into the Q&A box, which is shown on the screen, and put general comments you have into the chat box. My wonderful colleagues Maria and Jade are online, and they're going to be monitoring these boxes, and we will get to your questions throughout the webinar or at the end of the presentations. So, thanks so much for joining tonight, and a big thank you to our presenter Natalie, who I will introduce shortly. Quite a short meeting agenda tonight. We're leaving plenty of time for questions at the end, and this webinar will be recorded, and I will circulate the presentation and some additional reference documents tomorrow, as well as a link to the recording. So hello everyone. I'm just going to launch a poll so we can see who we have online. So please take a moment to respond and feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box as well. Got some responses coming through now, and I'll share these with you. I'll just give you another 20, 30 seconds or so. All right. Gosh, the results are still coming in. And I'm going to end the poll now and share these with you. So the majority of people online tonight are apartment owners, a few renters, some building managers, some strata managers as well, some industry people and some council staff members as well. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming along. So we all know emergencies are unexpected. They can happen anytime and anywhere, from fires, storm damage, floods, heat waves, structural defects, building collapses, pandemics, and now earthquakes, as we saw this morning. The impact of an emergency can be greatly reduced if your strata community is prepared for it. With 80% of the City of Sydney's residents living in apartment buildings, it's important to make emergency planning in strata a priority, which of course is why we are here tonight. Recently, we surveyed strata communities in Sydney, The majority of the respondents were in the City of Sydney local government area, and I'd just like to share a few of these questions with you. So from the survey, 46% of respondents thought their owner's corporation would respond poorly to an emergency or were unsure how they would respond. And I think this really highlights the need the owners' corporations need to improve how they're going to respond and also communicate this to their residents. Another interesting response was the top concerns regarding the ability of owners' corporations to respond to an emergency. The most common responses are on the screen, and they include language barriers, not having protocols in place, the evacuation of elderly and impaired residents, and not knowing the contact details of tenants. And the final question I'd like to share with you is that most respondents did not have an emergency preparedness plan. So the 40% that did is excellent, however, the 60% did not. And this ties in nicely. This week is the Red Cross's Emergency Ready Week. So over the past year especially, we know how emergencies can happen, and we know that they can affect all of us. And we can't stop these happening, but we can definitely prepare for them. So for your households, we highly recommend that you download the free Get Prepared app by the Australian Red Cross, and the information on how to do that is on the screen. We also recommend you complete an emergency plan and make friends with your neighbours on your floor and nominate one of them as your emergency buddy. So tonight's webinar is going to provide you with practical advice to help you prepare your building for an emergency, whatever that emergency may be. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Natalie Fitzgerald from More Than Strata. So Natalie is an award-winning strata manager with 20 years experience. She is well known in the sector for having managed some of Sydney's most complex buildings, as well as for her management of large defect matters and remediation projects. So Natalie, I'm going to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you. Just bear with me one moment while I get us up and running from my side. Sorry, guys. Everything works until it doesn't when you're live.
That's always the case.
The share screen, here we go. All right. My preteen will be laughing at my lack of technology right now. Thank you so much, City of Sydney, for having me. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. I too am on Gadigal land, and I would like to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. Well, a good day to talk about emergencies in strata today after an earthquake in Melbourne. Completely unexpected for all of us, but probably a good example of exactly the nature of emergency, which is that we don't know when they're going to happen. All we can do is plan as best as we can. What I'm really hoping to provide you with today is some, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about things to do before an emergency. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what to do during the emergency, and then finally in the aftermath, because quite often, particularly if you find that you have media attention, or there's going to be tension within the building, no matter what you do, some people are going to think that you didn't do the best job possible. We're going to spend some time talking about what to do when everything's over as well. So types of emergencies, and perhaps some of these we haven't necessarily always thought about. So we have acts of nature. I probably wouldn't have put earthquake on here, to be honest, as a first thought, had I not been watching the news this morning. But obviously earthquake, flood, and storm damage are the most common that we see. And it's important to stop and think about how that might impact not just the building in particular, but also around you. An example of that is I have a building in Newtown. And during a particularly terrible storm, part of the roof actually blew off and fell across rail lines. And that's something that we hadn't considered, but probably should have. So while we did have an emergency protocol in place in terms of evacuation and communication, what we didn't have is who do we contact when part of our roof is now sitting on rail lines. So something that I'll talk about later is considering what's around you as well as the immediate building. What I'm calling accidental incidences, fire going off, sprinklers being activated, people renovating and knocking off a sprinkler head and sprinklers going, that causes quite a lot of damage, and you will find you need to evacuate. What I'm calling human incidences, so hydrant discharge is the one that comes to mind and one I've had experience with. So when somebody has turned the hydrant on in a building, and hydrants discharge a lot of water, so the flood damage is extensive. Criminal emergencies, so you can have chemical exposures that occur if people, for example, are cooking drugs in a building and you end up with exposures that need to be dealt with. Obviously, we now have health orders that we've seen happening and directly impacting strata, and I'm going to talk about that particularly in relation to the strata role and the fact that we've now got health orders to make sure that those are up to date, as well as structural defects issues, which we've all seen obviously in the media in terms of Mascot and Opal Towers. I'm not going to focus on that too much because I feel like it's kind of been done to death, to be honest. And with the exception of the health orders where we're trying to keep people in, what we're going to talk about tonight applies to every one of these in any case. So you'll find that it doesn't matter which one of these emergencies you are experiencing, all of the information that I provide is hopefully going to be helpful. So before an emergency, and we saw that in the answers earlier today about the biggest fear is that you don't have contact details for tenants. And I would go as far as to say you don't have correct contact details even for owners in some cases. Perhaps even the managing agent isn't up to date. The strata role is absolutely going to be everything, and it's imperative that it's kept up to date. And there's a few ways to kind of do that more proactively. Often we kind of think that, well, the property manager will send through the new tenants details, or we'll wait until we get the information. But that's not going to be that helpful because we know that, strata is generally the last thing on anyone's mind. We're normally the last to know when there's a new owner. Then we're definitely the last to know when there's a new tenant. So a few tips and tricks is every contact that you have with your neighbours, get their details and get their permission to share those details. If they're a tenant, make sure you get that information to mark off that they're a tenant, find out who their managing agent is, if they're an owner, and let them know, I'm going to share this with the strata manager if you have one, or I'm going to make sure this information is on the strata roll. Do you want to be part of our WhatsApp group or whatever medium you're using? And I'm going to talk about the fact that we can't just rely on email to communicate with people. So getting to know your neighbours is really helpful in terms of having vital details like who they are and how to contact them. And that also extends to getting to know the demographic of your building. And I'm going to talk about that later as well, particularly in relation to communication and using different platforms to do that. Another trick, and I'm really insistent on this in my office, is that every time somebody calls, the strata manager, if you have one, or the building manager, should be checking that the details are correct. So every phone call should start with, can I confirm these are still your current contact details? And it seems like a painful thing to do, but again, it's going to be a discipline that just makes sure you have as many contact details as humanly possible. And another trick, if you're a larger building with a building manager, the strata manager and the building manager should be cross-checking each other's information regularly. And there are ways to do that. If people out of their different software systems can kind of download Excel documents and kind of lay them on top of each other and things like that. Again, it may feel like a tedious task to do, but it's super important when you're dealing with emergencies. And I recommend that strata managers in particular, but again, if you're self-managed suppliers, Section 258 of the Act does require by law that the details of a leasee be provided for the strata role. And the requirement is a name of a tenant, an address for service of notice, the commencement date of a lease, and the name of any agent. You can obviously extend that and ask for telephone numbers and email addresses in case of an emergency. But at the very least, these are the details required to be provided to the Owners Corporation for the strata role. And there is, in fact, a $550 fine for failure to comply with that requirement. So it does put the Owners Corporation in a position where they can be negotiating harder, I suppose, with property managers than perhaps has previously been done, especially since we've now got health orders. Dr. Chan sent a letter out encouraging and saying we need this information, it needs to be up to date. So again, it takes discipline, and it's going to take work, and it's going to take a commitment to follow people up. Quite often in buildings, we find there will be 1 or 2 or 3 prominent property managers. Get in touch with them, find out which properties they're leasing, kind of really proactively look to manage to get this information. And as painful as it may seem now, it's definitely a matter of spending time now to save a whole bunch of issues later. And this directly goes into the communication protocol, and I can't talk about this more. This is going to be the thing that makes your emergency situation work or not. And that's going to be working out who is going to say what, to who, when, and on what platform. And you don't want to be working this out on the run. You want to have this information agreed to, on file, and ready to go should there be an emergency you need to deal with. So first of all, do not rely on a single form of communication. I can't more strongly tell people that email is not going to get to everybody. The reality is that people change email addresses, they change jobs, tenants move in and out. Some people don't even use email. Personally, I'm not on email if I don't have to be, because I'm working on other platforms. So things to think about. And again, this is about knowing the demographic of your building. Is what other platforms can you use successfully to be able to get out to everybody you possibly can. So text is a really great, simple option. Most strata management and building management softwares will have a text feature built in, so you can text everybody in one go. So text is great. WhatsApp is another fantastic way to get in touch with people quickly in a group situation. WeChat, if you have a lot of people, particularly if you have a Chinese population in your building who prefer to work WeChat, that's a great way to be in touch with people. Using social media pages, if the building has a Facebook page or community page, getting messages out on Twitter, and even creating a web platform if that's possible. These are all options for you to think about what suits your building and what's going to be able to get the messages out to the most people as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So really knowing your community is going to be part of agreeing on which platforms you're going to use. The next thing you want to do once you've kind of got that information in hand is create your actual protocol. So you need to know what information are you going to just distribute, how, and by who. So you want to perhaps consider, will you create stakeholder groups? Will there be a committee group, a residence group, an owner-occupier group? Will there be a separate group for owner investors? Are they going to be impacted differently? If it's an insurance claim, they're going to have a different set of needs to an owner-occupier or a resident or a tenant. So it's really important to kind of think about what information is going to go out to who, how you're going to create those groups, and most importantly, who's going to be in charge of getting that information out. What can happen in these situations, particularly in a larger building, but in any really, is the rumor mill starts happening really quickly, and you want to be able to control that and to prevent it from getting out of hand as quickly as possible. And that may be by deciding who is going to be in charge of getting information out on those platforms. Make it really clear that that's the official channels that you're going to be communicating through as an owners corporation. So if people are hearing rumors from others, they know that no, that's not what's going on. I need to refer back to this communication channel, whichever it may be, so that I know what's happening. So communication protocol is absolutely top of the list. I'm preparing a handout that will go out to all of you with a bit of a checklist for emergencies, and I'm going to put a draft communication protocol on there as well for you to kind of manipulate it and make work for your building. But I can't speak, again, this is key to making an emergency work or be able to manage an emergency as best as possible. What we then have to deal with when the emergency is actually happening. So we've got our communication protocol and we know how we're going to talk to people. We've got our allocated people who are going to be doing that part of the communication. So what next? What's your immediate actions that you need to undertake? Well, are we evacuating the building? Are we evacuating whole or part of the building? And are we doing that because it's been ordered by an authority? Or are we doing that in the immediate as a precautionary step or measure, and then perhaps it becomes authority ordered later. If we're only evacuating part of the building, who is making the decision on what part of that building to evacuate? More than likely, that will be common sense. So if I go back to the example of the fire hydrant incident, so I can use one I'm aware of, one where a fire hydrant was turned on the 27th floor of a building. And so every floor underneath for half of the building was flooded. So that whole half of the building needed to be evacuated, but the building was pretty much separated by two. So the other half didn't. And that became fairly obvious in the medium term, but in the immediate term, the whole building had to be evacuated because obviously water and electricity do not mix, and there was water everywhere. Thinking about as well, and it was mentioned before, if you have elderly or impaired residents, do they have a buddy? Do you know who they are? Is that recorded on a system somewhere? And this comes back to managing your strata role. Do we need to have more information there? This may not always be possible in a very large building unless you have a fantastically proactive building manager. But definitely in your medium to small buildings, it should be relatively simple for someone to have information for the entire building. And if not, having or allocating, if you like, a kind of like a safety warden, like a fire warden for separate parts of the building. So depending on your building, it might be appropriate to have that per floor, or you might cut your building up into quarters or into eighths or whatever is appropriate, and allocating hopefully a proactive committee member to kind of be the warden. And that person will know who needs help in the event of an emergency to get people out, and make sure that the authorities know, that fire services know. Do not try and get somebody who needs help out yourself. The physical part of that may be too difficult, and the fire brigade will help you in those instances. So knowing who's in the building, and part of your communication protocol will, if you go ahead and put those wardens, for lack of a better word, in place, then that will form part of that communication protocol as well. You're going to go ahead and make safe as quickly as possible. So if you don't have a building manager, you're going to be calling the strata manager in. Hopefully they're able to come on site and see for themselves what's happening. If not, you're going to, they're going to kind of obviously manage that remotely, but you want to make the building safe as quickly as possible, whether that's storm damage and you're securing parts of the building so that they don't blow off anymore, whether it's getting the fire hydrant turned off and all the power. In that case, we had to turn the electricity off quickly, whether that's getting assessments done really quickly in terms of structural damage that may or may not have occurred, but obviously make safe is your first plan. And then, is it an insurance claim? Inform the insurer anyway. You're obligated to tell the insurer of any major events, so make sure that they're aware. And in all likelihood, it is going to be an insurance claim that you're dealing with. But let the insurance company know either way, and that may have an impact on how you proceed with repairs as well. Will have an impact. And the other what that happens. Our first what is what to do. Our next what that you're going to be wanting to know yourself, and that other people are going to want to know, is what happened. So you want to obtain a clear understanding of what's happened, and you're probably going to need expert advice to do that, unless it's something really obvious, like there was storm damage or someone, caused a kitchen fire or something like that. But sometimes you may need expert advice, and you're going to want to communicate that out. Once you get past your immediate make safe evacuate process, people are going to be asking what happened. And you're going to want to be the one, as the owner's corporation, who is controlling what information is going out there. But what you don't want to do is be too preemptive. You don't want to assume that you know what the what is. Excuse me. You may want to take some time and be honest. If you don't know yet, it's better to communicate that it's still being investigated than to assume an answer that may be incorrect, or again, to let that rumor mill take over. So clear, concise communication out on the channel you've already agreed to, through the person you've already allocated, and making sure that the what is something that the owner's corporation is in control of the information going out. The next thing you're going to have is the two hows. How do we go ahead with getting all of these what's in the first few minutes, few hours, few days, and then also the how did it happen. So once you know what happened, the next question you're going to have is how. So how do you initiate the communication protocol? In and of itself, the protocol will include, these are the triggers to make a communication protocol come into action. So it may be if more than half of the building, more than a third, you'll know your own buildings and what's appropriate need to be evacuated, then the emergency communication protocol comes into place. You may need to consider things like, is it appropriate that we put the communication protocol into place if, for example, there's a sewer overflow and perhaps only 2 or 3 apartments out of 12, do we go to that protocol? Is it appropriate or not? Those are things that are really going to come down to you discussing and knowing your building and putting that in place. So first of all, initiate your communication protocol, and you're going to know through creating the protocol whether it's the right term to do. You're going to have to start thinking pretty quickly, again, with your experts, how is the issue going to be fixed? And there's going to be immediate, medium, and long-term plans. And again, when we're communicating with our owners and our residents, need to make it really clear that in the immediate, you may not know how it's going to be fixed in the long term. What you need to do is make safe right then, and then look at how things are going to go further on. And what suppliers will you need to engage? And it's a good idea to have an idea of who these people are going to be before an emergency starts. Have a list of preferred contractors, have a list of people that know your building. Have you got consultants that you've previously used? Even if they're not the type of consultants who you need on your building, perhaps they can recommend somebody appropriate depending on what the emergency is. You might need remediation people, plumbers, fires, your fire company. Your fire company is probably going to have to be there no matter what in the first instance, because they're going to have to reset alarms that will likely go off in any emergency, albeit maybe not the pandemic. And so again, where in terms of record keeping, who's going to have this information, who's going to be charged with getting people on site? It may be the strata manager. That's kind of the logical place to start, but it could be a committee member who's particularly proactive. It could be your building manager if you have one. If you're self-managed, who in a self-managed building has this information and is able to get on the phone and get these people there quickly. So really important that those are, after getting everybody out, the next thing you're going to be doing is making safe. And so you're going to want to know who's going to be at the building. So kind of part of your communication protocol, but more part of your emergency procedure. And then the next thing that's going to happen is everybody is going to want to know how did it happen? And depending on the incident, you may not have an answer in the first few hours. You might not even have an answer in the first few days. And I didn't want to talk about it too much, but if we refer back to kind of Opal and Mascot Towers, there was no how for a long time. There was no way people were going to know the how until, proper investigations have been undertaken. If there's an earthquake, we know the how, there was an earthquake. So depending on what's happened, there's going to be either, a really simple answer for this or not a simple answer at all. And it could be a long time before you have one. But again, the key to this and managing this question is going to be how you communicate about it. Keep it regular, even if the answer is we don't know yet. Be honest. So don't try and hide the fact if you don't know as an owners corporation. There is nothing wrong with saying we don't know yet. We're waiting on experts. This is the process, and be as concise as possible as well. And then the next thing we're going to be dealing with is a when. So people are going to want a timeline. And I would suggest creating a timeline as soon as possible, letting people know that that timeline is going to change. It's been created in the moment, but letting them know that you're aware of how important that is to everybody. And again, communicating, updating, getting this out to people as soon as possible. This is obviously a very simple example, and depending on your situation, there could be very, very many more steps on this. But obviously you want to evacuate and make safe, work out who needs to be involved. Do you need insurers? Do you need consultants? Do you need emergency builders, emergency plumbers, fire company, depending obviously on what's going on. You're going to get the repairs undertaken, you're going to get people back, and then you're going to go through it and review everything that's happened. This is going to, like I said, have many more steps depending on what's going on, but put some dates on things as quickly as you can, communicate it out to people, update them when things are changing. The more people know about what's going on, the more safe they're going to feel that the situation is going to be resolved. And again, I know I keep talking about this communication protocol, but it is going to be the most important thing that you can do. And you are going to have to section that off into two two different departments, if you like, when you're having these types of emergencies. One will be internal, so people you're communicating with within the building, and the other, depending on what's going on, could be external. And I've put this on there because we're seeing after Opal and Mascot, suddenly people have, and the fires in Melbourne, people have realised that strata exists. Obviously, we all know that, and City of Sydney know that because most of their LGA live in strata, but the media has kind of always ignored strata as an interesting story. But now they don't. Now it's something that's getting their attention. So I suspect that more and more when there are emergencies in buildings, we're going to see media attention. And that may not be something that people are particularly trained in. I just saw somebody, a strata manager, on the news tonight for looking after a building in Hornsby that seems to have been impacted by the earthquakes in Melbourne. Who would have thought that was possible? Is the strata manager the appropriate person to be in the media? That's not a decision you want to be making in the midst of the emergencies. So again, going back to the protocol sheet that you're going to create beforehand. So you're going to have internal communications with the strata committee, the strata or building manager, depending on if you have one and how your building is set up. The strata committee / strata building manager may sit side by side, depending on the relationship and how your building works. And then you're going to obviously have owners and tenants and property managers. And then you could split owners as well into owner occupiers and investment owners, because how they deal with the emergency could look different. So just being aware, creating a kind of tree, and you may not, one person doesn't necessarily have to be in charge of all of this communication. You can split it up. In fact, I'd recommend splitting it up because it's going to be really stressful for the whole committee, for your strata manager and for your building manager. So sharing the load is positive, and because you have a communication protocol in place, everybody will know who they're speaking to and what they're saying. And then likewise, you want to have an external protocol. So is the strata committee going to communicate to the strata manager? Are you going to consider a PR person? And that may seem a bit left of center, but if it's a big enough issue, it may be something you want to do, because what you want to do is obviously protect the value of your property. Part of doing that is protecting the reputation of your building. And we know, media are going to go after an interesting story. And if your story isn't that interesting, they may look to kind of enhance or create one that's a bit bigger than really is. And having a PR person in place to make sure the information getting out to the media is correct information is going to be particularly important. And by having really great communications in place, you're going to prevent owners and tenants going to the media with horror stories. One, hopefully you don't have any horror stories, so you've kind of managed that as best as you can, but they're going to feel comforted enough in what's going on that they don't feel like they need to speak to the media about what's happening. One thing that always comes to my mind is there are people from Opal Tower saying that, they spent Christmas Eve in their cars. That was never necessary. There was alternative accommodation made available immediately. And it always makes me think, like, where did that breakdown happen? And, did it even happen, or was it something that kind of got to the media? So things to keep in the back of your mind. As big as it may feel, is it appropriate to have a PR person? And again, think about that when creating your communication protocol. The aftermath of an emergency, so things that you're going to have to deal with afterwards. Can a repeat event be prevented? Do you need to look to increase your security? This may be the case if you have a criminal emergency. Unfortunately, there has been incidences, thankfully not too recently, with some pretty severe criminal consequences in buildings. So do you need to look to increase your security? Fire services equipment, is it all in the right place? Did it do its job? Was everything working the way it needed to be? Do you need to have more regular building inspections? So while we want to make sure that we are planning for this as much as we can before an emergency, sometimes it takes the thing to happen for you to be aware of it. I keep using the fire hydrant example because it was such an unexpected one for me to deal with, or that I would not have expected. And it turns out you can have locks on a fire hydrant with special keys on them, but then you have to do, well, is that extra 20, 30 seconds that the fire brigade, who should be the only ones turning on a fire hydrant, require? Is that too much of a risk? So there's lots of things to kind of weigh up and think about. You're going to review, so you're going to look at your communication protocol, what worked, what didn't work, what can we update, what's kind of the best thing for us to do in terms of who did what, and then you're going to want to make sure that somebody, as I said, is managing the media. So I thought I'd throw over to questions for now, and I can go back through any of those kind of points that I've made in more detail with people. I can see there are a few questions, which is fantastic.
Yes, there are. Thanks so much, Natalie. That was really, really insightful. So we have quite a few questions to get through. So I'm just going to read them out and hand them to you, Natalie, if that's okay. So first question is from David, and he's asking if a strata role is confidential, or can the strata committee access it from a manager?
Yeah, that's a great question. The strata roles are not confidential. And I'm always telling people there are no secrets in strata, to be honest. So what used to be of question was whether or not email addresses formed part of the strata role or not. But now that the legislation, the 2015 legislation, which obviously commenced in 2016, came out, and you can have your email address as your service of notice. It kind of got rid of that question and says email addresses are absolutely part of the strata role. So the secretary can request a copy of the strata role at any time, and any owner can request a copy of the strata role by doing a strata search if the manager won't provide it. But having the committee should absolutely have a role and have an updated copy of that regularly. I would think that's kind of part of your committee duties, and certainly something that we provide.
Great. And then just adding on from that, are there any privacy rules around the committee knowing personal details of owners or tenants?
Not if they're shared with you. So things like service and notice, address, phone numbers and emails are not considered kind of personal information in terms of the strata role for managing a strata scheme. So the committee can have those as part of their job of managing the strata scheme, in particular the secretary. If you gain personal information, so for example, if somebody disabled and unwell, do they have a small child who they might need help with? As long as those are being kept for the purpose of managing an emergency, that's absolutely fine.
Great. And then in terms of the Privacy Act, is a verbal yes sufficient for those details to be shared, or does that need to be in writing?
No, I think a verbal yes would be significant or sufficient. Sorry, absolutely. I mean, if people were concerned, if you, I know, if you have someone who's particularly litigious in your building and you're concerned, you could get something in writing for your own records as a backup, if you like. But it's not something that I'd be too concerned about.
Okay, great. And who is supposed to supply the information of new owners and tenants, and what happens if these are never supplied?
Yeah, it's a big issue. So new owners, their details are meant to come from conveyancers or the solicitors who've handled the sale, and they come through on a predetermined form that they're supposed to use. It's often the last thing that gets done. But what a strata manager can do to check, if you're not sure, is if the strata manager or a self-managed scheme has issued a Section 184 certificate, so the kind of pre-sale strata certificate that people get, that's a sign that a sale is about to start. So if you've issued that certificate and then you don't get new owner contact details, you'd probably start following people up and saying, hey, what's going on? Otherwise, if you've just gone through a levy cycle, it could be 3 months before you hear, because the old owner will call you and say, hey, you sent me a levy notice and it's not mine anymore. Or worst case scenario is they don't call you and you don't know, and you're not getting levies in and you don't know who's in the building. So again, it's about being proactive in managing that strata role and really giving it the attention that it deserves. It's not just an administrative task. It's super important that it's correct. So that's one way to kind of check for new owners is checking those, if those Section 184s. Have you got an application to put a for sale building up? Have you got inquiries about how much the levies are? The type of stuff that tell you a building is going on market or that a building, an apartment has sold. In terms of tenants, the property managers and owners, investor owners are obligated to provide that information. And as I said, there's even a fine for failure to do so. But again, it's probably going to take a whole bunch of proactiveness to get people used to knowing that as a strata company or an owners corporation that you are going to follow up and you do want those tenants' details and you are absolutely recording them on the strata roll. So letting them kind of know that as a culture, that's really important to your owners corporation, and creating those relationships with local property managers near your building will really help that as well.
Great, thanks, Natalie. And another, I guess it's related to that question, how would you handle an owner who takes in lodgers and refuses to provide the names and contact details of those lodgers in their unit?
Yeah, look, it's a difficult one. The new short-term letting legislation does kind of put some requirements on details of people staying to be provided in certain circumstances, but not all of them. So depending on, I guess, how are they lodgers under a short-term letting agreement, in which case they're required to give you that information, or are they lodgers as in they might have international students who come and stay for a period of time and then leave again. Is that considered a sublease? Probably yes, I would say, in which case they are required to provide you details of a sublease. But I would also sometimes, rather than relying on the law, I find that kind of relying on humanity and kind of explaining to people why you need the information. You don't want it because you're trying to catch them out for short-term letting. You don't want it because, you know, it's nothing. You want that information for safety reasons. You want it because in the event of an emergency, we need to know who's in the building. It's the same with pets. Pets is one I always talk about. You want to know what pets are in buildings. And letting people know that you're not keeping that information because you want to find out who's got what pet, although that's kind of useful. It's really so that you can, you know, let the fire brigade know who will look for pets after they get humans out. That is like a service they provide. So just kind of letting people know why it's so important. And again, we're kind of blessed in a way. I don't like to use that word, but there's been, because there has been a lot of media attention on strata emergencies lately, you can kind of refer to what people are seeing in front of their own eyes anyway. That, you know, just today there was an earthquake. You need to know who to contact in the building.
Yeah, of course, that's so important. So then in practical terms, maintaining these, how do you recommend maintaining them?
Yeah, look, if there's a strata manager, they should be using, you know, strata management software, which makes it really, really simple for them to not only be keeping all of the information, but the history as well. So you can go back and see when and where things have been changed. As a strata committee, a lot of mine get a copy or an updated copy of the roll quarterly. And they will let me know if they've noticed somebody move in or out. So they often will alert me to, hang on, this isn't up to date anymore. We noticed a change in tenant. So it's going to be a lot of communication back and forth between whoever is in charge of the role and how they keep that, which is most likely the strata manager. If you're self-managed and you don't have kind of a software platform assisting you, Excel is king in my mind for keeping that type of information. And as I mentioned, the building manager and the strata manager checking their information against each other is really important, because often the building manager will be the person in touch with a tenant in the case of, you know, general repair, or they've asked for another fob, or that's a really fantastic opportunity to make sure you know who's in the building and to swap that information and make sure everyone has the same records.
Yeah, it's a really, really good tip. Another question around the strata role. Can an owner who is overseas request that strata management send a copy of the strata role by email to the overseas owner?
An owner can do a strata search, and as part of doing that, so that's the opportunity to look at all the books and records. They have the right to do that. And as part of that, they can request that the strata role, you wouldn't generally put that there for privacy reasons. There's no law against it, but just as a, you know, a best practice protocol. But if they request it, you have to give it to them. How you conduct that strata role, the act requires that it be done at a mutual location. These days, obviously, most of those are happening online. I haven't had strata searches in an office in 5 years because it's all happening online. So I don't think that's an unreasonable request. There's who owns an apartment is not private information anyway. You can get that information from Land and Property. So people kind of need to understand that it's not a secret. Again, there's no secrets in strata. So I don't feel that's an unreasonable request, and certainly it's a legal one.
Great, thank you. And then around the responsibilities on keeping the strata roles, should they be kept in a shared cloud location or a physical location, and how would the committee decide whose responsibility it is to manage this?
Yeah, look, I think shared documents are a fantastic resource. for anybody to be using as much as possible. And even, if you do have an emergency and you're managing like a huge task list, that all that type of information should be in a shared capacity so people can see what's going on simply and easily. In terms of the strata role, unfortunately, strata technologies are still, in terms of our software, there's not a lot of them available, haven't necessarily caught up with cloud to make it easy to share that type of information. But what you could do is have a kind of shared file that's available to everyone or to the committee that then gets checked, as I said, quarterly, and made available that way. But if you can, if a committee member is happy to kind of transfer the data, and it can come out of software in a CSV file, if a committee wants to kind of be in charge of that as well, that's another option. But yeah, I think the more people that know who's in the building in terms of committee and people who would be managing an emergency, the better.
Great. And for buildings that have strata managers who sort of hold the strata role, should the strata committees be requiring after hours direct mobile from that strata manager in case an emergency happens?
Sorry, my daughter's finishing up dinner. No, absolutely. You should have an emergency. It's going to depend on each building and each company and how it works. I know a few of the larger companies have emergency hours that go through to kind of a bank of people. My mobile number is the emergency contact details for our company. So it's going to depend on the business and how big it is, but you absolutely want to have someone you can contact in an emergency. My only tip on that, and I apologize if this sounds obvious, is call 000 before you call the strata manager. I've had people call me and say, I can see smoke out the window, and have you called 000 yet? No, I was calling you first. Call 000 first. Then call the strata manager, even if it's not a fire or it's not an emergency, better to get it checked then and be safe than sorry.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's all the questions around strata roles. So moving on, we've had a question come in. Are strata buildings required to display fire and evacuation wall maps in the common areas?
Interesting question. It's going to depend on the building and whether or not it's been required to have a fire safety plan in place. Obviously, any building in kind of the last 20 years, yes, but some of the older buildings may not. In which case, it's a good idea to do it anyway. You'll find them in lobbies, you'll find them next to lifts, right next to the do not use in event of emergency. They should be fairly kind of predominantly displayed where they are. But if you don't have one because you're not required to have an annual fire safety statement, then I would invest in getting them done anyway.
Okay, great. And a question from Jane, which I think is a really interesting question. How do you know who is in the building when an emergency starts?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. And we've seen that particularly come out with the pandemic and when we're trying to keep people in instead of getting them out, which is a reverse of kind of everything we've learned and we're experienced in doing. And we know one of the issues was, well, what if somebody's on holidays or they've decided to move in with a parent during the pandemic or whatever the case may be? What if there's guests? In terms of right now in the pandemic in particular, I've been registering our buildings for the QR code check-in. You're not required by law to use it in a building, but people kind of do, as most people will, because it's the right thing to do. So that's I haven't had to deal with that, but I do have some confidence that if one of our buildings did have to get shut down because of the spread, then or lockdown, we would have that information available as much as possible. Otherwise, again, you're kind of relying a lot on people giving you the information they should, and that's where those kind of being as proactive as possible tips come in. So checking the security systems, if you're fobbing in and out, who's fobbed in and hasn't fobbed out. It sounds tedious, but if that's what you have to do to make sure everybody's safe, then that may be the process you need to go through. The fire brigade will go and check every apartment, obviously, as part of their role, but the more information you give them, the better.
Great. So then regarding the QR codes, would you then recommend residents to check into their own buildings when they leave and exit the building, or would it just
Absolutely.
be externals like deliveries or
Yeah, look,
anyone?
we put them in place initially. Well, I did with the thought of externals in particular. So when work people were allowed back on site, admittedly under some pretty strict conditions, we had a lot of customers that were understandably very nervous about that process, particularly when you're only a limited amount of people were allowed on site at once and that type of thing. So the QR code was a way of helping to provide some peace of mind in that regard. But we had kind of encouraged residents to use it as well. And it's, this is only going to be applied in the event of the pandemic at the moment, but it's a way for people to kind of access. Is it something that will be used in the future to manage those types of emergency situations? We're all used to doing it now. I feel in some ways it probably, should have been forced, probably not. Like we civil liberties, there's a balance there. But I see in the future of there being some sort of way of being able to quickly assess whether it's a QR code or security systems being updated so you can more quickly access who's fobbed in but not fobbed out and things like that.
Great. And then keeping on the COVID theme, how are you handling New South Wales Health now that they're no longer informing strata managers of COVID cases in buildings anymore? Are you having any issues with that?
Look, I haven't experienced it personally. I suspect it will be happening somewhere. We've definitely been asking, and you can't force people to tell you, but for people to let us know should there be an event or someone be diagnosed positive. And you wouldn't disclose to an entire building who that person is, but you would certainly want to let the building know that, yes, there is a positive case. If they've been using the QR codes, health will contact them as a casual or a close contact in any case. But definitely, just communicating again as regularly as possible with people to let them know that, it's safe to let you know that that's happened. Nobody's going to let them know who it is or point fingers. It's just to kind of get that information out there.
Yeah, definitely. And a great question from Richard around risk planning. So Richard asks, to what extent should, for example, an earthquake be risk assessed for the likelihood and impact of that particular type of major event taking place?
Yeah, that is a good one and a hard one. In terms of, like I said, I would not have thought that an earthquake in Melbourne would be having impacts in Sydney, and I would have rated earthquake pretty low, before today in terms of something to be concerned about here. And perhaps we still do. Like it's the first time I'm 20 years in, I can't remember this occurring previously. But I think you're going to know your environment and where your building is at. Flood is a really important one. We also kind of the Brisbane floods in particular. Fire clearly is a really, it's a matter of where is your building, what are its immediate possible issues. Are you need bushland? Are you in a particularly stormy area? So it's really about kind of where is your building and what is the likelihood of that happening. But in most emergencies, the initial phase of what you need to do isn't going to change that much anyway. You're still going to need to communicate with people. You're going to have to inform the insurer. You're going to have to have a make safe plan. So what may change is who comes into that make safe plan, which contractors you get on board, but the communication protocol itself is probably not going to be all that different, no matter what happens.
Great. Okay, so we've still got about, I think, 6 or 7 more questions to go. So hopefully we can try and get through these before the end. A question from Jane about Airbnb vandalism. As you mentioned, the fire hydrant damage to the building in Olympic Park. Is there anything, that can be done to try and mitigate this?
Yeah, with the new requirements that who's in an Airbnb, I think that would make a big difference. That Jane's obviously in the know because it was an Airbnb guest who turned on that fire hydrant. That was in the media, and criminal charges were laid in that event, and we did find out who they were, and they went into state, and it was all a big mess. But I think the fact that there's now a requirement for that information to be provided in the 3 strikes. So if you don't do the right thing, you can be struck off. But it's definitely going to be, I think managing short-term learning is going to be the hardest part of keeping emergency plans working the way that they should. We know in a hotel, for example, that they know who the guests are and they have the contact details. Who realistically should be in charge of having the Airbnb guest? Is that something you expect the strata manager to do? They're not going to do that for free. Should the owners corporation all have to pay more fees? Because there's the whole kind of myriad of hornet's nest there. But it's something that needs to be unpacked in more detail for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, a question from David. Can insurance cover every contingency?
No, absolutely not. Most of them, absolutely, but they're not going to cover defects, structural issues. So an emergency caused by a defect is not going to be covered by insurance, and which is important to be aware of. Flooding, we know you need to check your policy and make sure it's covered. The really important thing with insurance that kind of gets unstuck in emergency is the loss of rent clause. So it is a loss of rent clause. It is not temporary accommodation for tenants. So if you are an owner, an investor owner, you absolutely have to have your own temporary accommodation or loss of rent insurance for your tenant. The strata insurance will repay you back a rent that you should have received in the event that you had a tenant, but it will not cover your tenant's emergency relocation costs. It will for an owner occupier. So that's really important and often something that's misunderstood because people will see the words temporary accommodation and think it applies to everybody, but it doesn't. So I always, that's the most important things in terms of insurance and what it covers. So yeah, insurance will come into place in 90% of emergencies, but it definitely won't in defect related ones.
Great. And a question from Michael. Is it a good idea to get your building a direct link to the fire brigade from your fire panel? And how would you get a telephone line installed to do this?
Yeah, look, if you have a fire panel, it is probably already direct linked to the fire brigade. It's normally a requirement that they are. And they're now running on GSM SIMs. So now that the copper phone lines have been disappearing thanks to NBN, most of them are running on SIM cards and usually dual SIMs. So if one network is down, another should pick up. If you don't have that because you didn't need to do it because your building wasn't of an age when it was required, or if you haven't gone through a fire order, if it's probably, being proactive in building maintenance and upgrades, particularly for safety, is always a positive thing to do. So definitely, will you get false fire alarms? Yes, absolutely, they happen. Will you have to pay fines? Hopefully not. If you only have a false fire alarm every 6 months, the fire brigade is not going to issue you a fine. They do that for buildings that have people that haven't maintained their systems and they're having call outs regularly. They're really there to stop those kind of nuisance call outs.
Great. Okay, we've got 2 more questions, if that's okay with you, Natalie.
Absolutely.
One around the creation of a communication protocol sheet. So if this isn't already created, who should be leading the creation of this? Should it be the owners corporation? Should it come from a strata manager if there is one? And should residents be able to see this so they know who is in charge?
Yeah, so where to start? Who's going to lead getting that communication protocol sheet in place? That's going to depend on your strata management company and what sort of services they offer. If they are going to do that, it's probably going to be an additional charge. But if they do it properly, it's a good value charge, something you can hold in your hands and that's valuable. But it may require the committee to kind of give the instruction to the manager that that's something that's really important to you. Hopefully everyone's hearing that and hearing that, yes, it is important and it should absolutely be done. Sorry, what was I'm slightly distracted.
That's all right. Should the residents be able to see this? They know.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't give an entire communication protocol out to residents because it should be a multiple page document with, diagrams and what ifs and things like that in it. What I would have for residents is an emergency contact sheet. So what to do, and you often see these in foyers, but sometimes they're dated and they're not current. So reminders to call 000. I know that sounds crazy, but when we're in the moment of stress, our minds don't always function like they do normally. So reminders to call 000, and then how to get in touch with a strata manager or a committee member if you prefer, whatever kind of is your building protocol. Make sure those are kind of sent out regularly. You might want to send text messages through your strata managers software systems, get them to send text messages every kind of 6 months or so, just reminding people of those details. So just kind of keeping them front and center as much as possible.
Great. And then last one, very quickly, regarding elderly residents and their evacuation. I know you mentioned that they should have a buddy. What happens if they don't? Would you allocate someone to be their buddy?
Yeah.
And should there be a system where buddies are registered on the strata roll, so you know who's got a buddy and who doesn't?
Yeah, look, on the strata roll, probably not, but definitely recorded somewhere. And this is where I was talking about that warden system that can be really helpful. So getting some fantastic committee members who are willing to kind of take charge of an area of the building, and they would then be aware, and having that kind of centralized information, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet on the cloud that all committee members have access to. But it gets back to us kind of reconnecting with our neighbors, and it's a great way for us to kind of do that in the first instance. So it may be incident. So while, you know, we don't want to be dealing with emergencies, it's a great way to kind of have the confidence to knock on someone's door and say, hey, I'm your neighbor. So if that's something you're a bit shy about, this is a really good reason to be doing it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Natalie. And thank you to everyone that came along tonight. So I will send a recording of this webinar as well as some additional resources from Natalie, and I'll send that round tomorrow afternoon. If you have a chance, I'd really appreciate it if you could fill out a feedback survey. That should be in the chat box now, and please feel free to join our Sustainable Apartments Facebook group and sign up to our monthly newsletter as well. So thanks again, Natalie. That was really, really great.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And yes, have a lovely evening, everyone, and hope to see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.